2:38 a.m. local time, January 17th, 1991. Baghdad. A Navy strike coordination document, declassified in 2003, now sitting in a filing cabinet at the Naval History and Heritage Command, lists 288 Tomahawk cruise missiles authorized for simultaneous launch across 9 warships spread over the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. 288. The number is typed cleanly at the top of the page, next to a time hack that reads 0238 Lima. Someone underlined it in pen. Below the number, a grid of target coordinates stretches across 4 pages. Power stations, telephone exchanges, air defense nodes, command bunkers. Each one assigned to a specific missile, a specific ship, a specific launch sequence timed down to the second. The document reads like a train schedule. Ordinary, bureaucratic. Except no nation had ever attempted anything like it before. The Tomahawk had been in the Navy's inventory since 1983, 8 years. In that time, exactly 0 had been fired in combat. Grenada came and went, so did Panama and every skirmish and standoff that filled the Reagan years. The weapon existed as a concept validated by test ranges in the California desert and simulation runs on mainframe computers at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. That's it. The full story of how 288 untested weapons launched into the dark and reshaped modern warfare is one most people only know the highlights of. If you want the whole thing, hit subscribe. Drop a like so this reaches more people. And if you've heard a version of this night from someone who was there, the comments section needs that. Dr. Williamson Murray, a military historian at Ohio State, who later co-authored the official Gulf War Air Power Survey for the Air Force, spent 2 years trying to reconcile what happened that night with what should have happened. His conclusion, buried on page 117 of Volume 4, published in 1993, the Tomahawk's combat debut exceeded every reasonable statistical expectation for a weapons system employed at scale for the first time. Murray was careful with language. He didn't say it was a miracle. He said the math didn't add up, and the math really didn't add up. Test range reliability for the BGM-109. Tomahawk Block 2 sat around 85% in ideal conditions. Clear weather, known terrain, no jamming, no anti-aircraft fire, no unexpected obstacles between launch point and target. 85% sounds impressive until you multiply it across 288 missiles and realize that means roughly 43 should have failed. Crashed into the desert, flown into the wrong building, corkscrewed into the Gulf, buried themselves in some farmer's field west of Basra. The Navy's own pre-war modeling, run at the Space and Naval Warfare Systems Command in San Diego, predicted a combat reliability rate closer to 77%. That's 66 missiles going somewhere other than their program target, 66 Tomahawks at $1.3 million each, $85 million in ordnance landing in empty lots and irrigation canals. What actually happened was different. The after-action reports, compiled over the following 6 weeks by battle damage assessment teams using satellite imagery, signals intercepts, and in some cases physical inspection of the target sites after the ground war, showed a hit rate that made the pre-war models look like they'd been written by pessimists. The exact number remains partially classified. Different sources give different figures. Murray's survey cites better than 90%. Vice Admiral Stanley Arthur, commander of U.S. Naval Forces Central Command, later told an interviewer the number was higher than anyone had a right to expect. A 1992 General Accounting Office report, the skeptics, the bean counters, the people whose entire job was to find waste, put the figure at somewhere between 85 and 95%, depending on how you defined a successful strike. Even the low end of that range defied the models. So, how did a weapon that had never been shot in anger, launched in the largest coordinated cruise missile strike in history on its very first night, beat its own test range numbers? The answer starts about 4,000 miles from Baghdad, in a basement in Suitland, Maryland, where a team of cartographers had been quietly building the most detailed terrain maps ever created. What were those missiles flying into? The densest integrated air defense network outside the Soviet Union. That's not hyperbole. The Defense Intelligence Agency's pre-war assessment, compiled across the summer and fall of 1990, used the phrase near-peer capability to describe what Iraq had built around Baghdad. Near-peer, meaning close to what the Soviets themselves could field over Moscow. The system had a name, KARI, a French acronym, reversed from the Arabic word for Iraq. Thomson CSF, the French defense electronics conglomerate, designed it, built it, and installed it, then trained Iraqi operators to run it. The contract dated back to 1979 and ran through the mid-80s during the Iran-Iraq War, when France was selling Saddam just about anything he could write a check for. Mirage F-1 fighters, Exocet anti-ship missiles, Roland short-range surface-to-air systems, and underneath all of it, KARI, the nervous system connecting every radar, every missile battery, every interceptor squadron into a single coordinated web. Thomson CSF modeled it on France's own STRIDA air defense architecture. The company that designed the system protecting Paris also designed the system protecting Baghdad. Same engineering philosophy and data fusion principles. Same hardened communication links running through buried fiber optic cable that couldn't be jammed from the air. The word exocet, incidentally, comes from the flying fish genus Exocoetus. The French have a habit of naming missiles after animals. The Roland is named after a medieval knight, which breaks the pattern, but Thomson CSF didn't make that one. Anyway, KARI operated through a hierarchy. Sector operations centers, 5 of them spread across the country, fed data upward to 4 intercept operations centers, which fed into a single air defense operations center buried under a reinforced concrete bunker in the Karada district of Baghdad. The whole thing functioned like a pyramid. Radar contacts entered at the base. Firing commands flowed down from the top. A MiG-25 pilot sitting in his cockpit at Al Taqadum Air Base didn't decide when to scramble. The bunker in Karada decided. An SA-6 battery crew south of Basra didn't choose when to illuminate a target. The sector center chose. This was the system's greatest strength. Total centralization meant total coordination. No fratricide, no wasted missiles, no gaps in coverage where 2 sectors failed to communicate. Every piece of the network knew where every other piece was looking. 600 radar installations fed the system. Between 16,000 and 17,000 surface-to-air missiles sat ready on launchers or in magazines. SA-2s, SA-3s, SA-6s, SA-8s, the French-made Rolands, layered from high altitude down to treetop level. A pilot approaching Baghdad at medium altitude would pass through 4 overlapping engagement zones before reaching the city center. The air above the capital vibrated with electromagnetic energy, radar beams sweeping in interlocking arcs, each frequency band covering what the others missed. Total centralization also meant something else. But that comes later. The Tomahawk wasn't built to hit Iraqi telephone exchanges. It was built to put a nuclear warhead through the front door of a Soviet command bunker in the Ural Mountains. 1972. The Navy wanted a weapon that could launch from a submarine's torpedo tube, fly over 1,000 miles of Soviet territory at treetop altitude, and deliver a 200-kiloton nuclear warhead to a target without any pilot risking his life over the most heavily defended airspace on Earth. The Cold War logic was elegant in its brutality. If the balloon went up, attack submarines lurking in the Norwegian Sea or the North Pacific would ripple-fire cruise missiles into Soviet rear areas while the ICBMs handled the big cities. General Dynamics won the development contract in 1976. First flight was 1980. The weapon entered service 3 years later, carrying the W-80 nuclear warhead, and for a while, that's all it was. A nuclear delivery truck. The conventional variant came later, almost as an afterthought. Congress pushed for it in the early 80s, reasoning that a missile this accurate shouldn't be limited to ending civilization. Swap the nuclear warhead for a 1,000-pound unitary high explosive charge or a cluster of bomblets. Same airframe, same engine. A tiny Williams International F-107 turbofan producing just over 600 pounds of thrust. Burning jet fuel at a rate so efficient the missile could stay airborne for nearly 2 hours. Same guidance. The guidance is where the story gets interesting. TERCOM, terrain contour, matching. The system worked by carrying a barometric altimeter and a radar altimeter pointed straight down at the ground. As the missile flew, it continuously measured the terrain elevation beneath it and compared that profile against a stored digital map. If the ground said, ridge here, valley there, flat plain for the next 8 miles, and the map agreed, the missile knew exactly where it was. No satellite signal required, no radio link to jam. The missile navigated by reading the Earth's face like a blind man reading Braille. The maps came from the Defense Mapping Agency facility in Suitland, Maryland, the basement mentioned earlier. Cartographers there had spent the better part of a decade building digital terrain elevation data sets for every potential Tomahawk flight corridor on the planet. Soviet ones first, then Eastern Europe. Then, starting in August 1990, when Saddam rolled into Kuwait, Iraq. The DMA pulled every satellite photograph, every geodetic survey, every scrap of elevation data the intelligence community had on Mesopotamia, and began building TERCOM maps for corridors stretching from the Persian Gulf to downtown Baghdad. A retired DMA analyst named James Gruber later described the pace as insane. We mapped more of Iraq in 5 months than we'd mapped of the Soviet Union in 5 years. TERCOM got the missile close, within about 100 meters of its target, give or take. For a nuclear warhead, that's plenty. For a conventional warhead aimed at a specific building in a city block, it's not. So the Block 3 Tomahawk added something new. DSMAC, Digital Scene Matching Area Correlation. A camera in the missile's nose took a photograph of the terrain below during the terminal phase and compared it against a stored image of what the target area should look like from directly above. The comparison happened in real time, adjusting the flight path in the final seconds before impact. DSMAC brought accuracy down from roughly 100 meters to single digits, a specific window on a specific floor. The Block 2 variant used over Baghdad on opening night didn't have DSMAC. It relied on TERCOM alone, supplemented by an early GPS receiver that could pick up signals from the constellation of Navstar satellites the Air Force had been launching since 1978. The GPS constellation wasn't complete in January 1991. Only 16 of the planned 24 satellites were operational. Coverage over Iraq was intermittent. The missile might have GPS for 40 minutes of its flight, then lose it for 20, then pick it up again. TERCOM filled the gaps. GPS refined the position when available. The two systems talked to each other through an onboard Litton inertial navigation unit that split the difference when they disagreed. 3 guidance systems working in concert. The first read the ground, the second read the sky, and the third kept track of its own motion through space. Redundancy on top of redundancy, designed by engineers who assumed the Soviet Union would be actively trying to kill the signal, spoof the terrain data, jam every frequency the missile listened to. Iraq wasn't the Soviet Union. The system designed to survive Moscow's defenses was about to meet Baghdad's, September 19, 1990. 5 months before the first launch. Captain Robert Honeywell at the Naval Weapons Center in Dahlgren, Virginia, received a mission planning order that asked his team to do something no one had ever attempted at scale. Program individual flight paths for what would eventually become 288 separate cruise missiles, each one threading through Iraqi terrain on a unique route, all of them arriving at their targets within a coordinated window measured in minutes. Each Tomahawk needed its own mission dataset, a complete package. TERCOM map segments for every waypoint along the route. GPS coordinates for the update points where satellite coverage was expected. Turn points, altitude changes, terrain following profiles calibrated to the specific geography the missile would cross. One missile might fly north from the Gulf, hook east around a ridgeline, drop into a wadi, follow it for 30 miles, then pop up for its terminal run into Baghdad from the southeast. The next missile, launched from the same ship 4 seconds later, might take a completely different corridor to hit a target 6 blocks away. The deconfliction problem was staggering. 288 missiles in the air simultaneously, converging on a single metropolitan area, flying at roughly the same speed, around 550 miles per hour, at roughly the same altitude. The planning team had to ensure no two flight paths crossed at the same point at the same time. A mid-air collision between two Tomahawks would waste $2.6 million in ordnance and leave two targets standing. The mission planning software at Dahlgren, called TAMPS, Tomahawk Weapon Control System Mission Planning, though everyone just said TAMPS, could handle individual routes well enough. Doing 288 simultaneously pushed the system past its designed capacity. The word Tomahawk comes from the Algonquian language family, likely Powhatan. Captain John Smith recorded a version of it in 1612. It originally referred to a cutting tool, not a weapon of war, though the distinction blurred pretty quickly after European contact. But that's beside the point. Honeywell's team worked in shifts. 16 hours on, 8 off. Each missile's route took between 4 and 12 hours to plan, validate, test against the terrain data, check for conflicts with every other planned route, then verify again. A single elevation error in the TERCOM data, one ridge miscoded by 50 feet, could send a missile into the ground. The DMA cartographers in Suitland were shipping updated terrain files to Dahlgren on a near-daily basis through the fall of 1990, each revision tightening the data, correcting errors found during quality checks. One former planner described the relationship as, "They'd send us maps, we'd find problems. They'd fix them overnight, we'd find more problems." The time-on-target coordination added another layer. Certain targets had to be hit before others. An air defense radar had to die before the Tomahawk aimed at the communications node behind it entered that radar's engagement zone. Sequence mattered. A missile arriving 8 seconds early at one target could mean a missile arriving 8 seconds late. At another, would fly into an air defense system that should already have been rubble. By early January 1991, the team at Dahlgren had produced mission data sets for every Tomahawk allocated to the opening strike. The files were loaded onto magnetic tapes and physically shipped to the 9 launch platforms, the cruisers, destroyers, and battleships waiting in the Gulf and the Red Sea. Each ship's combat information center received its tapes, verified them against the master plan, and loaded them into the weapons control system. The missiles sat in their launchers with the tapes holding their orders. The timestamp was set. So, what happens when you press the button on a weapon that's never been fired in combat? The crew of the USS Wisconsin found out at 1:30 a.m. local time, January 17, 1991. The battleship was steaming in the Persian Gulf, running dark, no navigation lights, her massive bulk cutting through flat water at 12 knots. She wasn't there for her 16-inch guns. She was there for the 8 armored box launchers bolted to her deck, each one holding 4 BGM-109 Tomahawk cruise missiles. 32 rounds total. The weapons officer had verified the mission data tapes 6 hours earlier, then verified them again. The first launch order came down the satellite link from Vice Admiral Stanley Arthur aboard the USS Blue Ridge. One word: execute. A booster rocket punched the first Tomahawk out of its launcher at an angle, trailing a column of white flame that lit up the Wisconsin superstructure like a flashbulb. The solid fuel booster burned for 7 seconds, accelerating the missile to flight speed, then fell away into the Gulf. The Williams turbofan spooled up, the stubby wings deployed. The missile dropped to its cruise altitude, somewhere between 50 and 100 feet above the water, and turned northwest toward Iraq. Then the next one fired, then the next. Across 2 bodies of water, 9 ships were doing the same thing within minutes of each other. In the Persian Gulf, the Wisconsin, the cruiser USS Bunker Hill, the destroyer USS Fife, the destroyer USS Paul F. Foster. In the Red Sea, the cruiser USS San Jacinto, the battleship USS Missouri, the destroyer USS Spruance. 2 submarines also carried Tomahawks, the USS Louisville in the Red Sea and the USS Pittsburgh in the Gulf. The Louisville's launch was a first of its own. No submarine had ever fired a cruise missile in combat. Her weapons officer, Lieutenant Commander Timothy Dorsey, later called the moment very quiet, then very loud, The whole boat shook. The Red Sea ships had the longer shot. Their missiles had to fly west to east across the full width of Saudi Arabia before entering Iraqi airspace, a route of nearly 700 miles. The Gulf-based ships had shorter corridors but more complex terrain to navigate on approach, threading through the river valleys and low ridgelines of southern Iraq. The planners at Dahlgren had accounted for this. Red Sea missiles launched first, Gulf missiles launched later. Both waves would arrive over Baghdad within the same narrow window. 122 Tomahawks in the first wave, 52 from the Red Sea contingent, 70 from the Gulf. The rest would follow in subsequent salvos through the night and into the next morning. But that first wave, those first 122, carried the weight of the entire air campaign's opening logic on their backs. They had to knock out the eyes of KARI before the manned aircraft crossed the border 90 minutes later. F-15 E Strike Eagles, F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighters, F-4 G Wild Weasels, Navy, A-6 Intruders, British Tornado GR-1s. All of them were counting on the Tomahawks to arrive first and blind the system. No one knew if this would work. Most people forget this part. The Tomahawk had been tested extensively at ranges in the American Southwest. Hit rates in testing ran between 85 and 93% depending on the variant and conditions. But testing is testing. The desert outside Tonopah, Nevada doesn't shoot back. The terrain data for Iraq was 5 months old in some corridors. The GPS constellation had gaps. The missiles had never flown combat distances over hostile territory with real air defenses waiting at the other end. Vice Admiral Arthur knew the stakes. If the Tomahawks missed, if they scattered across Baghdad hitting nothing of value, the manned aircraft flying in behind them would face KARI at full strength. Pilots would die. The air campaign timeline would collapse. Arthur had pushed hard for the cruise missile option precisely because it risked machines instead of men. But the trade-off only worked if the machines performed. He reportedly told his staff on the evening of January 16th, "If these things don't work, we're going to have a very bad morning." The missiles were in the air now, 122 of them skimming the desert floor at 480 knots, their TERCOM systems reading the terrain below, comparing it against the maps built in that basement in Suitland. Each one carrying a 1,000-pound warhead toward a specific building, a specific wall, a specific coordinate in Baghdad. 45 minutes to impact. The air over southern Iraq at 2 a.m. in January tastes like dust and diesel. Cold, 42 degrees at ground level, dropping fast with altitude. The Tomahawks weren't at altitude. They were down in the dirt, 50 feet above the desert floor, close enough that the exhaust wash from their turbofans kicked up thin trails of sand behind them. No one was awake to see it. At 50 feet and 480 knots, a Tomahawk crosses a mile every 7.5 seconds. The radar altimeter fires 60 pulses per second straight down, measuring the gap between the missile's belly and the ground, feeding corrections to the flight control surfaces faster than any human pilot could process. A ridge appears. The missile pulls up, clears it by 30 feet, pushes back down the other side. A wadi opens beneath it. The missile drops into it, following the contour like water. The TERCOM system checks the terrain profile against its stored map every 8 seconds, confirming position, adjusting course. The whole process is mechanical and relentless, and completely invisible to KARI. The French-built radar network that Saddam had spent $8.6 billion assembling was designed to find aircraft. Aircraft fly at altitude. Even low-flying strike jets, tornadoes, A-6 Intruders operate between 200 and 500 feet on a combat run, popping up periodically to acquire targets. KARI's low-altitude radar coverage was calibrated for that threat profile. The Soviet P-15 flat-face acquisition radars and the French-made Volex system stationed along Iraq's southern border could detect a fighter-sized target at 200 feet from roughly 40 miles away. Below 100 feet, ground clutter at the return signal. The radar beam bounced off dunes, off rocky outcroppings, off the hard-packed Sabka flats, and the returns swamped the processor. A small cruise missile with a radar cross-section, roughly equivalent to a large bird, flying at 50 feet, the system literally could not distinguish it from the terrain it was flying over. Iraqi radar operators that night saw nothing. The screens showed the usual low-altitude noise, occasional returns from ground vehicles on highways, scattered clutter from the marshlands along the Shatt al-Arab. Routine. One former Iraqi air defense officer, interviewed years later by the Gulf War Air Power Survey team, described the period between 1:30 and 2:30 a.m. as normal. We had no indication of attack from any sector. His unit was stationed at Talil Air Base in southern Iraq. The Tomahawks flew within 12 miles of his position. The missile's physical profile made the problem worse for the defenders. A Tomahawk in flight presents a frontal cross-section of about half a square meter. The body is cylindrical, 20.4 inches in diameter, roughly the width of a dinner plate. No vertical stabilizer to catch radar energy. The wings are short, swept slightly, tucked tight to the fuselage. The engine intake sits underneath the body, shielded from above. The whole airframe was designed in the 1970s to penetrate Soviet air defenses that were orders of magnitude more sophisticated than anything Iraq possessed. It wasn't stealth, not in the F-117 sense of shaped surfaces and radar-absorbent coatings. It was something simpler. It was small and it was low, and it was fast enough that even if a radar momentarily picked up a return, the contact would vanish on the next sweep. Somewhere around 2:15 a.m., the first wave crossed the Euphrates River, heading north. KARI still showed green across every sector. All quiet. The operators at the Sector Operations Center in Baghdad had no reason to believe otherwise. The missiles were 19 minutes out. Lieutenant General Ayad Futayeh al-Rawi picked up the phone in the Sector Operations Center at 2:34 a.m. He was calling the Air Defense Command Post at Al-Taqadum to confirm a routine status check. The line went dead mid-sentence. 4 minutes later, Baghdad ceased to function. The first Tomahawks hit the telephone exchange on Rashid Street at 2:38 a.m. They didn't hit the building in general. They hit the specific switching room on the second floor, the one connecting military trunk lines to the National Command Authority. The 1,000-pound unitary warhead punched through the roof and detonated inside the concrete structure, shredding the Italian-made switching equipment into fragments the size of playing cards. 2 seconds later, a second Tomahawk struck the International Telecommunications Center 4 blocks east. Then the power grid started dying. The Dora electrical substation took a direct hit at 2:39. The Al-Hartha thermal power plant in Basra, 400 miles south of Baghdad, was hit within the same 60-second window. Coordinated, simultaneous, or close enough that no one on the receiving end could tell the difference. CNN's Peter Arnett was broadcasting live from the Al Rashid Hotel. The footage is famous now. Streaks of light, distant concussions, anti-aircraft tracers arcing into empty sky. The Iraqis were shooting at nothing. KARI's operators had no tracking data to feed the guns. The network was already dying. The SOC's hardened communications bunker took a Tomahawk through its ventilation shaft at 2:41 a.m. The Intercept Operations Center, linking KARI's 5 regional sectors, went dark 30 seconds after that. The anti-aircraft fire over Baghdad was spectacular and completely useless. Gunners were firing barrage patterns, predetermined arcs of tracer rounds meant to fill airspace with shrapnel. The technique works against aircraft flying predictable approaches at known altitudes. The Tomahawks were arriving from every compass heading, at rooftop level following programmed routes that jinked between buildings. An Iraqi gunner on the Palestine hotel roof later told a BBC crew he never saw a single missile. He heard them. A low hum, then a whoosh, then an explosion somewhere behind him, then silence, then another hum from a different direction. By 2:52 a.m., 14 minutes after the first impact, KARI was functionally dead. 17 of its 24 primary nodes had been destroyed or severed from the network. The surviving 7 had no communications links to each other. The integrated system that had cost $8.6 billion existed only as isolated, blind fragments. The manned aircraft crossed the border at 3:58 a.m. into uncoordinated defenses. A wheat field outside Al-Hilla, 60 miles south of Baghdad. January 18, 9:14 a.m. A farmer named Hassan al-Juburi found a Tomahawk missile lying intact in an irrigation ditch. The engine was cold. The warhead had not detonated. The missile had simply run out of fuel and pancaked into the mud at whatever speed a dead turbofan and gravity produce. Al-Juburi thought it was a downed aircraft. He sent his son to find the local Ba'ath Party official. It was one of several. The declassified strike assessment from Central Command compiled over the following 72 hours tells a less cinematic story than the CNN footage suggested. Of the 288 Tomahawks launched during the entire opening phase of Desert Storm, roughly 242 reached their designated target areas. The Pentagon initially claimed an 85% success rate. The General Accounting Office, Congress's own auditors, later revised that number downward to somewhere around 61% when success was redefined to mean the warhead actually struck the intended aim point, not just the general neighborhood. The difference between those two numbers is the difference between a revolution in warfare and a very expensive fireworks show. Some missiles just wandered off. TERCOM matching depends on the stored terrain map being accurate, and in featureless desert, the kind of flat, undifferentiated sand sea that covers much of southern Iraq, the system struggled. Every dune looks like every other dune. The correlation algorithm needs contrast, ridgelines, elevation changes, hard features. When it can't find a match, the missile holds its last known heading and hopes for better terrain ahead. Better terrain sometimes came. Other times the fuel ran out first. Others hit the wrong building. In Baghdad, a Tomahawk programmed for a Ba'ath Party intelligence office struck a residential structure 200 meters north of the target. The guidance had performed correctly through 600 miles of flight, then drifted during the final DSMAC terminal phase, possibly because the reference photograph used for matching was taken in daylight and the missile arrived in darkness. Shadows fall differently at 2:40 a.m. than they do at noon. The residential strike killed 14 civilians. Their names do not appear in the after-action report. The Pentagon briefings in Riyadh told none of this. General Schwarzkopf stood at the podium with gun camera footage showing Tomahawks threading through streets, turning corners, diving into ventilation shafts. The footage was real. It was also selected from the best hits out of nearly 300 shots. Nobody showed the missile in Al-Juburi's irrigation ditch. This is where the story bends. The Tomahawk worked. By any honest historical measure, it worked extraordinarily well for a first-generation precision weapon seeing its first combat. 85% of missiles reaching their target area on the first night of a war launched from ships scattered across two seas, navigating autonomously for hundreds of miles. Nothing in the history of warfare had come close. The problem wasn't performance. The problem was the narrative that performance created. American defense planners walked away from Desert Storm believing they had solved the problem of war. Precision strike meant you could hit what you wanted without hitting what you didn't want. Surgical. Clean. A Rand Corporation study from 1993 used the phrase, "a new American way of war," without irony. The phrase stuck. It metastasized through the defense establishment, the think tanks, the congressional committees that write budgets, the op-ed pages that shape public expectation. If one Tomahawk could kill one target, then war was just accounting. Count the targets, count the missiles, do the math. The farmers in Al-Hilla knew better. So did the family in the residential block 200 meters north of a Ba'ath Party office. Precision is a spectrum, not a toggle switch. A weapon that hits its target 85% of the time, misses 15% of the time, and 15% of 288 is 43 missiles landing somewhere unplanned. 43 1,000-pound warheads arriving without invitation. But the gun camera footage played on every network for weeks. The Tomahawk became the symbol of American technological supremacy, which it was. It also became the symbol of clean war, which does not exist. That second belief would shape American military planning through Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, again in 2003, Libya, Syria. The missiles flew straighter with every campaign. The faith grew faster. August 20th, 1998. 3:17 a.m. local time in Khartoum, Sudan. A Tomahawk launched from the USS Briscoe in the Red Sea struck the Al-Shifa pharmaceutical factory. The CIA believed the facility was producing precursors for VX nerve agent. The intelligence was based on a single soil sample collected by a Sudanese agent months earlier. The factory actually manufactured about half of Sudan's anti-malarial medication. The rubble smoldered for 2 days. No American boots touched Sudanese soil. No American pilot flew through Sudanese airspace. The strike was authorized, executed, and finished before the White House press corps had coffee. This became the template. 3 days later, 75 more Tomahawks hit training camps in eastern Afghanistan. Bin Laden had left hours earlier, maybe days. The missiles cratered empty tents, scattered cooking pots, killed 26 people, most of them Pakistani militants from a different organization entirely. Each missile cost about $1.1 million. The math works out to roughly 66 Tomahawks per missed target. But the political math worked differently. No casualties on the American side, no downed pilots on Al Jazeera, no body bags at Dover. The president could announce the strike at a podium and take questions about proportionality rather than flag-draped coffins. Kosovo, 1999, 218 Tomahawks in the first 72 hours. Serbia, a country the size of South Carolina, absorbed cruise missile strikes for 78 consecutive days. Milosevic didn't capitulate until day 79. The missiles hit their targets with steadily improving accuracy. GPS-aided navigation had replaced the old TERCOM-only system by then, pushing circular error probable down to around 10 meters. They hit ministry buildings, bridges, television transmitters, power transformers. They hit the Chinese embassy on May 7th by accident, killing 3 journalists because someone at the CIA used an outdated street map. The address was wrong. The missile was perfect. 30 years of American strategic addiction in one sentence. The weapon always improved. The targeting lagged behind, and the decision-making lagged behind the targeting. By 2003, the opening salvo of Operation Iraqi Freedom used more Tomahawks in 48 hours than the entire Gulf War had expended in 43 days. By 2017, 59 Tomahawks hit Shayrat Air Base in Syria in response to a chemical weapons attack. The runway was operational again within 24 hours. The missiles cost about $92 million total. The runway repairs cost considerably less. The weapon that was supposed to make war precise had made war easy to start. The United States Navy launched 288 Tomahawk cruise missiles during Desert Storm. The total cost of those missiles, at $1.35 million per unit, came to $388.8 million. The entire KARI air defense network they were fired against cost Iraq $8.6 billion. The exchange ratio favored the Americans by a factor of 22 to 1 before a single manned aircraft crossed the border. The border crossing is the point. The Tomahawks were never supposed to win the war alone. They were the door kicker. The manned strike packages that followed, F-117 Nighthawks, F-15E Strike Eagles, F-111 Aardvarks, A-6 Intruders, Tornado GR-1s from the RAF, flew into airspace where the integrated defense network had been blind for over an hour. Coalition aircraft flew over 4,000 sorties in the first 24 hours. 2 planes were lost. The pre-war models had predicted losses of between 30 and 75 aircraft on the first night alone. CENTCOM's planners had pre-positioned search and rescue assets expecting to pull dozens of crews out of the desert. They pulled out 2. The cartographers in Suitland, Maryland, never flew a combat mission. Neither did the TERCOM programmers at General Dynamics, who never heard anti-aircraft fire, or the Navy targeting officers who spent 5 months hand-building flight routes on classified workstations and never felt a missile leave a tube. The weapon they built crossed 600 miles of hostile territory at 550 miles per hour, navigated by comparing radar snapshots to stored maps of terrain it had never seen, and struck specific rooms inside specific buildings in a city of 4 million people. at 2:38 a.m. in the dark. Lieutenant General al-Rawi survived the war. He was captured by American forces in 2003 during the invasion and held at Camp Cropper near Baghdad International Airport. During interrogation, he described the opening minutes of January 17th as the night the system died. He said the phones stopped first, then the radios, then the power, then the radar screens, in that order over approximately 12 minutes. He called the sequence professional. He was released in 2005 and returned to Mosul. 288 missiles launched. Approximately 242 reached their target areas. Between 176 and 209 struck their intended aim points, depending on which audit you trust. 46 missiles failed in flight or went off course. 14 confirmed civilian fatalities from errant strikes in Baghdad alone. 0 American casualties from the Tomahawk phase. Total flight time from first launch to last impact, 4 hours, 11 minutes. Total cost of munitions expended, $388.8 million. Total cost of targets destroyed, estimated $11.2 billion in military infrastructure. Somewhere in Suitland, Maryland, on the morning of January 17th, a DMA cartographer named Patricia Lyons clocked in for her shift and started building terrain maps for the next set of coordinates.